I basically saw your article on the Jacobin on the 17th of April, the one that was published on the 17th of April on why COVID show why we must socialize the food system. And it really got my attention because it's, it really makes explicit a lot of points that not only are hot topics at the moment because of the coronavirus, but also because for those who works on food and the political economy of food, we really need to think through. And I think your article gives a lot of food for thought. Yeah, so basically what we are doing here at the Open University is that we are taking this opportunity of the coronavirus to gather like intervention from different disciplines and different topics and different fields, and within the umbrella of our School of Global Studies and Social Science.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I mean, thank you again for accepting our invitation. So today we're going to spend some time discussing basically, I mean, from your article, I have a couple of questions, but they're guidelines. So feel free to basically, divert to whatever you might think is relevant. And so I'm going to introduce yourself, and it's basically, I can see that you are now an associate professor of geography.
That's right.
At Syracuse University. You are the author of Lifeblood, Oil, Freedom, and the Forces of Capital, which is a very interesting connection, oil and food, and maybe we might explore that.
Yes.
But also you're writing a new one.
Yes.
I just saw on your bio, on your website, it's called Climate Antagonism, Class Strategy for a Warming Planet with Verso.
Right.
Great. So good luck with that.
Thanks.
So it's going to be looking forward to reading it.
Thank you.
So let's start. Basically, I was wondering if you, just to have a sense of what we're talking about when we think about this crisis of the food system, is like, if you can tell us more about why you think that the corona crisis and the coronavirus has kind of highlighted these tensions in relation to the social crisis and the ecological crisis you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Well, on the one hand, it's become really obvious how irrational this system is. In the United States, we have farmers all across the country just destroying crops because of the lack of the prices are collapsing, the demand's collapsing from restaurants and schools and other places, so they feel like they have nowhere to sell this, so they're just going to destroy it. On the other hand, we have food banks, which are the sort of food charity organizations that try to distribute food to people who are hungry and need. They don't have enough food to distribute to poor, hungry people. There are lines of people showing up at these food banks, miles long lines of people desperate for just a box of food. And so it just shows how this system is clearly not serving the needs of the mass of the people. And it shows how irrational it is from just delivering food as what basic humans require to survive. But on the other hand, as I go into the article, for those that really want to dig into deeply into how this virus came to us from Wuhan and from China, and you start learning about the ecology of viruses and how they're transmitted, and these are called zoonotic viruses that are transmitted from animals to humans. And we think the coronavirus may have originated in bats and then through other animals showed up at this wet market where they basically sell a variety of type of animal products in Wuhan. And so, but what scholars like Rob Wallace have shown is that basically it's the encroachment of capitalist agriculture, capitalist extraction like mining, and monoculture type agriculture that has encroached upon basically wild areas where these viruses are more common, because these viruses do tend to accumulate in the bodies of wild animals, so that those wild animals are more likely to be in wild areas. And so as capitalist extraction and agriculture expands into frontiers, it comes closer into contact with these wild areas and wild viruses. And because those agricultural and extraction zones are basically trying to produce commodities that then get transported out of those areas into the circuits of capital, into transportation and global commodity flows, it's very easy to understand how the virus can kind of hop on board onto human hosts in these circuits, and then as we saw with the coronavirus, become basically global within a few weeks. It just sort of spread across the world through air transport and various other circuits very quickly.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Yeah, so basically, yeah, it's true. Like this loss of biodiversity coming into this commodification of agriculture is actually exposed even more, like our ecology to this set of viruses spreading all over. Yeah, that's incredible. That would be like, yeah, I would be very interested in learning more about maybe interdisciplinary with like like scientists, not like social scientists like that, but having maybe for opportunity for future research. But when you talk about the global, that really fits very well with my second point and these questions, that it really interests like what you were discussing about in the article about this tension on local food production as a response, as a kind of a romanticized response to the small is beautiful versus what is the reality. And I was reading this article last week on Bloomberg. I have it in front of me. I haven't read it again, so I don't have the exact details, but I can share it with you if you're interested. And they actually basically say that countries are starting to hoard food, and there has been the coronavirus has also been a threat to the global value chain as we know it. So you mentioned the fact that the food system, the global food system rely on a very specific framework, which is organized around global supply chain that, as you rightly mentioned, they're actually managed by multinational corporations, but they have essential workers on the front row. And so I was thinking how this goes back to your points and your questions that you were posing about this contradiction and these tensions between local and nationalism in relations to the food system. I know that
So it is a real tension. It's very I think seductive and kind of alluring to sort of look at our horrific industrial agricultural system, the way in which we organize it as monocultures, which are in many ways you could sort of see it as sort of anti-ecological. It's just trying to grow one species over these types of homogeneous kind of plantation style agriculture. And so that people often look at those and say, well, that's terrible, so I want something different. And we have lots of examples around the world of something different. And we have small scale peasant agricultural that's still viable for many communities, increasingly less so, but is still a way of life practiced by smallholder agriculturalists all around the world. So I think what happens is people be like, well, there's our answer, right? We're just gonna reform our agriculture to look more like this, small scale. But the problem is I want to be clear, like those communities have lots of people that have these livelihoods, and oftentimes they have to struggle to maintain them against forces of enclosure, displacement, debt, all sorts of problems. And we should support their efforts for what is called food sovereignty and land sovereignty and these types of efforts. But I think the people who look to these models as the answer also sort of assume like, well, those smallholder peasant-based systems can also feed the masses of the world that have what capitalism does is it tears the majority of people from the land and forces the majority of people to rely on commodities to survive, to rely on money. This weird social thing we do, which is we don't directly engage with the food and land we need. We actually need to work for money, which allows us to go to a place that sells this food for sale. And it's sort of capitalism was built by dispossessing the masses from the land, forcing them into a wage market where they have to work to obtain money to survive. So I give some statistics. I think it's like 72% of the world workforce is not working in agriculture, right? They're working in they're basically making a living in some other way that gives them access to money where they access food commodities. So if we look at that reality, I think it's a bit audacious to assume that if we just replace our existing food system with smallholder peasant food production, that it could actually feed these 72% of people. And in fact, I worry about that because peasant communities are already exploited enough and are already struggling to provision their own communities. Yeah. And so why should we, why should we expect them to feed the world as well? So then the question I pose in the article is, okay, most of us rely on these food systems to survive. So how can we think about repurposing them and transforming them, not rejecting them in total because they provide a lot of advantages? And how can we repurpose them if we could take control of the food system, not for profit, but for social needs in a crisis like this? How could we reimagine, repurpose the existing food systems with social need as the goal? And there's a number of advantages I see to these systems that I could expand upon, if that sounds okay.
Yeah. I mean, that would be my question, like the next question, because this also relates to the policy solution that the public, and the government and the role of the state has proposed, which, I mean, to me are like UBI, food stamps, food banks, all these like very consumption-led kind of solutions. Right. So please go ahead if it's really.
I think those types of solutions don't actually solve the problem we have in our food system, which is it's controlled by a handful of massive agribusiness companies that, like the Monsantos, the Cargills, these huge companies, and they kind of exploit us as consumers on one end and farmers as producers on the other, and they're kind of in the middle. They're the processors, and they're the ones that are linked up with the big retail corporations that sell us all this food. So they're sort of making all the profits in the middle.
And consumers don't even know they exist because they don't show on the label. Yeah. So it's really hard even to track politically this entity. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you give someone a UBI of $1,000 a month, let's say, and they just hand that money over to these massive agribusiness companies for their food, it doesn't change the power structure of the food system at one bit. Even food stamps, which are great, but food stamps are basically a government transfer to these food corporations. So a socialist perspective really wants to look at production and democratizing production, so that basically for me the bread and butter of socialism is imagining a democratic production system where we actually could structure production not narrowly about only profit and competition, but human need and social needs. So so then again, we would try to actually reform the actual production of food in ways that was more accountable to communities, to the workers in these systems, and to the people that rely on these food systems, to what actually they want our agricultural system to look like. But the thing I wanted to point out is that we live in a society where the masses of people, because we've been torn from the land and we've been forced into the market to survive, we live now in a society like in the United States. I think 1.5% of the labor force works in agriculture. And so we live in a society where most people don't have connection with agriculture. So we can't just assume that if we want to change production, it means sending millions of people to farms to work in what I can tell you are very hard skill-based jobs to work on farms. It's very difficult, backbreaking work that requires enormous skill. And if you think it would be easy to sort of marshal millions of people to go work on farms, I think you can look to history where states have tried to do that, and it doesn't often go well. So we need to, I think, again, a lot of the small is beautiful, like sort of rejection of industrial agriculture just thinks we're going to go back to kind of small scale peasant-based methods that are labor intensive. They require lots of human labor. And I think for a society where most people don't do farm work, that's not really an option. So we actually need to think creatively about production of food where we do take advantage of the forms of automation and mechanization that exist in agriculture, and try to think about how we can repurpose machines, robots even, to make farming more ecological, but not incredibly. I mean, it might have to be slightly more labor intensive. We might have to acknowledge that for ecological reasons, but we don't want to just assume it can be like way more labor intensive where we have to go from 1% of the population to 30% back to the land, back to the farms. I just don't think that's a viable political solution for a society where most people don't want to do that kind of work.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I mean, there are a lot of articles in the Jacobin, but also in other magazines where they're starting to think and reflect and discuss the possibility of adopting and transferring the organization of corporation like Amazon that have such a sophisticated, algorithm-based system of logistics and distribution. Why not socializing that? And why not kind of trying to replicate with obviously the social needs factored into them.
Right. Yeah, and that's another thing I bring up, that these supply chains they use incredible amount of computing power and information technology to plan. That's what the argument is. They're actually, companies like Amazon and Walmart are planning on a large scale, which is what socialism is also about. But those companies are planning for profit, right? They're planning for their private shareholders, and that's the only goal they have. But if we could take those systems, those technology systems, and say we want to plan for ecological rationality, we want to plan for social needs, there's incredible capacities to do that in these systems. So you're probably referencing a book called The People's Republic of Walmart, which basically shows that. And this is a very kind of old Marxist story, that capitalism, by developing technologies for profit, actually creates conditions for socialism by creating these incredible socialized labor systems, like a global supply chain. That's an incredibly actual social system that requires coordinating workers and people across the globe. It's incredibly socialized, but now the profits from those systems are appropriated by private actors. And so the goal of socialism is to take actually already existing heavily socialized labor systems and put them under social control, democratic control, so that we can guide them towards, again, human and ecological needs.
I completely agree. And then there is open like the discussion of how internationalist that also could be. But when you have a system that gives at least more leverage to the public, to the democracy, also it opens up another politics of what are the different interstate dialogue.
Absolutely.
And then comes my last question, that is like it's more like to go back to what we start actually with the food bank and the community based and about like the food politics. So I'm working on a small project that we just started on food poverty in London. So I don't know if you heard, but UK, I mean, I'm a development economist by training, and so I've been working on low-income countries for many years. But then recently I've been realizing that there is food security. It's something that is, you mentioned that with the food banks, and this is like, it's a social phenomenon. It's a socioeconomic phenomenon that is actually becoming like predominant and visible in our cities, in the global north.
Yes.
So, and I was like interested in understanding a bit more about the public-private relations, but not only in reference to profit-based, but also to what is a non-governmental and community-based organization.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so basically, I was thinking, like, what do you think, about what is the role of this, like, of charity, of social, of the kind of the civil society to address the politics of food, and how these actually are complementary to what we've been saying about, like socializing the system.
Well, I think kind of like the Walmart example, we don't want to just discard these networks and these community-based organizations. They might have a lot of infrastructure that's useful. But I think on the other hand, at least in the United States, there's been an interesting sort of long-term historical process of kind of defunding the state and austerity at the public level that has led to all sorts of cuts in public welfare and systems of public provision that have actually forced a lot of private organizations, whether it be churches or charities or non-governmental organizations, to in many cases heroically, but nevertheless to fill the gap in these kind of private ways, and that can be good, and they serve communities. But the one thing we can say about some people refer to this as like the NGOization of kind of public provision, and those organizations are often controlled and governed as again private organizations with their own budgets, with their own agendas, with their own personnel. So again, even if I'm not a socialist, if I'm someone that's more liberal and just concerned with democracy, my preference would be for something as important to human life as food to be part of the public domain. That's something that we in a democratic society have to kind of come together as citizens. This is sounding really liberal now. Come together and deliberate and debate about what our food provision system should look like. And so therefore, my preference would be to build up a more robust public system of food provision that could, again, maybe partner with and work with these existing private organizations, but then subject those organizations to more democratic oversight and democratic control.
Yeah.
Now, the other part of that is, I believe, because as you mentioned, we are dealing with this acute crisis right now where people they don't have any money and they need money to get food. This is sort of basic of capitalism. And so a lot of people are starving. A lot of people are lining up at food banks and things like this. So I do think we have an opportunity to kind of reassert this notion I put in the article that we really should have a politics of food being a human right. In the United States, not in the UK, but in the United States, this idea of healthcare as a human right really became a big rallying cry in the politics recently, because we don't have.
I can imagine why. Yeah.
Yeah. So because we don't provision healthcare as a human right like most other countries, but in the United States, it's even globally, like it's just weird. Like, why, if healthcare is a human right, why don't we think of food as a human right? You could argue food is even more important to human well-being than healthcare, but there's this sort of taken for granted common sense thing that, well, of course, food is provisioned by private for-profit businesses. That's just, and of course, like if you can't afford food, that's just too bad for you. Which
or
seems like
a healthy one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And we have a lot of poor communities in this country that really lack access to even healthy food because there's no stores that find it profitable to operate in poor neighborhoods. So
and
this
this
idea,
like aggravates the health, no? Because if
yeah,
you eat junk food, then it's like, so it's a vicious cycle of, yeah. So
absolutely.
it's, yeah, no,
So
it's
just this
good.
basic idea of food as a human right to argue that we should actually decommodify the system and make it a public system. It it's increasingly sounding reasonable in these kind of crisis conditions, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, one of my friend working on this that I interviewed informally just to scope a little bit the issue, because a lot of people are now on furlough, so they're volunteering. She was mentioning the volatility of food donation.
Mm.
So, like within this charity. So
Yeah.
basically, it's because it's all up to the individual to be good or to be,
Right.
like,
Right.
so that's also creates volatility in the system. So, and
Right.
they have no enough food. I mean, there's been articles already like mentioning that before the interview. But yeah, there is like now a lack of food even in the food banks places. So, but yeah, thank you very much. That was really interesting, and we are gonna basically edit a bit. I mean, we have editors who do this, and I'll be happy to share with you before we post it online.
Great.
And I really hope to keep in touch because your work sounds amazing, and maybe we can do a book launch.
Yeah.
Now it's like with the when is gonna be published?
My hope, if all goes according to plan, is probably about summer 2021. That's my best case, I think. My goal was to come to the UK for the Historical Materialism Conference, which happens
Oh,
in
great!
London in
Yeah, great. Yeah, I
2021. So who knows what travel will look like then? Who knows what the
yeah.
pandemic will look like? But that was my plan. So.